One of the best things about animation is that there are so many different types of styles with multiple genres that has only grown and expanded over the last couple of decades. However, the core of animation remains the same, creating characters, worlds, and stories with moving drawings based off of your own inspirations and imagination. Eventually, they'll invigorate the next generation to do the same with their increased knowledge and technology that time will be able to grant us. But sometimes doing something incredibly simple will be just as groundbreaking as something incredibly complex. With that said, today we're going to be talking about the 1991 Nicktoon classic, Doug. Created by Jim Jinkins, Doug is the story of a young 10-year-old boy named Doug Funny living on a town called Bluffington with his mom, dad, his older sister Judy, and dog Porkchop. He has a group of friends that he hangs out with, such as Skeeter, Chalky, Connie, BB, Al, Moo, and his crush, Patty Mayonnaise. He also has a group of bullies led by Roger Klotz. They tease Doug, but they would eventually get their consequential downfalls later on in the episode. While the premise of Doug may not sound very special by today's standards, it was indeed a much-needed program when it first came out. Why? Well, that'll be our subject with today's topic. How did Doug become influential with its simplicity?
It's not just cartoons. We're Nicktoons. Not just cartoons.
We're Nicktoons.
Not just cartoons.
We're Nicktoons.
Not just cartoons.
We're Nicktoons.
Now, continuing with the premise of Doug, looking a bit more deeper, all of the issues that Doug was going through were relatable. The main plot of Doug were, for the most part, Doug's struggles with everyday life, such as school and growing up. Everything from being fearful of going to the school dance because he didn't know how to dance, finding a new barber to get a haircut, struggling to complete a homework assignment due to playing a video game obsessively, and getting his first pimple. At one time in our lives, we all went through a period of feeling unsure about ourselves, whether we want to admit it or not. Seeing a show like Doug on TV was a way of showing kids that they weren't alone with their insecurities. There was someone close to their age and grade who was going through similar problems that they went through at home or at school. Another trait that Doug had made a lot of people relate to him were his daydream segments. Whether Doug was going through a problem or hears about a situation that's going to happen later, he thinks about the best and worst aspects about it. I'm sure a lot of us have gone through that as well. I know I did as a kid. And then, of course, there's his imaginative personas. These in itself became the highlight of the show. Characters like Quailman, Smash Adams, and Race Canyon had become memorable moments in the series, especially the Quailman segments. Based on a superhero that Jim Jinkins performed when he was a kid, Quailman was a superhero with little to no powers that relied on his intelligence to save the day. Doug Funny became like an animated role model, representing the average kid for young kids and preteens of the early 90s. His personality was developed enough to showcase his interests, but enough of a blank slate to insert ourselves into his shoes. He was the Charlie Brown of our generation. More on that later. The art style of Doug was inspired by Jim Jinkins, who mostly doodled as a kid. The pencil lines that highlight the characters and setting makes it look like a comic strip coming to life. The opening segment shows Doug drawing a small, thin line, and all the little actions that are performed with that line, showcasing the direction of the show that will be presented. While today this may seem primitive, the art style was familiar yet unique compared to what the other cartoons were presenting at the time. The town of Bluffington was small enough to have a small town where everyone knows your name approach that made you feel at home, but big enough to have different and varied locations that stood out and kept things interesting. There's the school, the Four-Leaf Clover Mall, Stitson's Pond, Lucky Duck Lake, and of course, the Honker Burger. Each of these locations may still keep to the simple approach that the show presents, but there are many memorable moments that occurred on these locations. Doug meeting Skeeter, Roger, and Patty for the first time at the Honker Burger. Doug trying to catch a nematode at Stitson's Pond. Doug and Mr. Ding trying to catch the mysterious Old Chester at Lucky Duck Lake. Doug and Skeeter meeting the Beats for the first time at the Honker Burger, and so much more. Bluffington feels like a town or city that we may or may not have lived at one point in our lives, but it's welcoming enough to feel nostalgically connected. Its size, landmark, and locations, as well as the characters residing in it, make it feel like home to us. Speaking of which, the characters are also relatable. Doug's best friend Skeeter represents your hyperactive and goofy friend who loves playing video games, sports, music, and making crazy mouth sounds. He's the loyal companion who will be there on your side when things get tough. Chalky is the sports prodigy, a natural athlete who lives, eats, and breathes sports. He's determined to be the best that he can be to please his equally athletic father and catch up to his older brother Cliff. Patty is a tomboy who loves sports just as much as Chalky. However, she loves to sing and dance, she's loving and supportive for all her friends, and has even gone through her own personal issues. In the episode Doug Rocks the House, Doug was throwing a rock over at an abandoned house alongside with Roger and his gang. He eventually knocked it down. When Patty saw it, she was angry at him, and Doug didn't know why. Turns out that the house that Doug destroyed was Patty's old home where her and her parents lived before her mom died in a car accident years prior. The same car accident even paralyzed her father from the waist down. There's even episodes like Doug's Cooking where Patty admits that she doesn't know how to cook very well, and we see her struggle with assisting Doug making a carrot cake. Then there's Doug Clobbers Patty, where she goes through a rough losing streak after Doug defeats her on bowling. She's unable to win any games or sports after that. Other characters also consist of Mr. Dink, the crazy next-door neighbor who buys a lot of very expensive devices and contraptions. Mr. Bone, the assistant principal who wants to see orderliness in the school but at the same time loves yodeling. There are two more characters I want to give a bit more attention to right before continuing with our discussion. First, there's Judy, Doug's older sister. She has a love of William Shakespeare, opera, foreign films, and art. Judy represents the beatnik era of the 1960s, wearing a beret, sunglasses, and playing bongos while reciting poetry. The beatnik era had a massive resurgence in the 90s, with all of them hanging out in coffee houses. According to a 1993 article from the Chicago Tribune, the comeback of the beatnik era alongside with the, at the time, modern grunge era, was a way of young people expressing themselves from a corporate, mainstreamed, and confined America. American poet Allen Ginsberg stated in the article, "The reason for recycling of beat poetry and artifacts and style is the realization that the country is beat, meaning at the end of the rope of conventional hope. Poetry readings have been going on a long time, but maybe they're more visible now because the need has become greater, because of the public deceptions of the past decade and the hypocrisy of the official language. I think it's a little different that in the 50s we're more innocent. In the 1980s, people became more disillusioned. After this public deception, what are people going to believe? The popularity of poetry reading says to me that people are trying to recover some human spirit. And fortunately, the human spirit is very resilient. In Doug, we see Judy embody the persona of going against the typical American lifestyle. She's dressed in black, she's wearing sunglasses, and she's obsessed with Shakespeare by watching Derek Derrickson performing Shakespeare on Ice. While the second trend of the beatnik era died around the beginning of the 21st century, the concept of going against mainstream and corrupted America propaganda is still strong, but in different ways. Whether it be watching independent films or listening to independent music and straying away from mainstream movies and music, supporting third-party politicians as opposed to going Republic or Demographic, or even having an independent online career posting content that you're passionate about as opposed to working on a 9-to-5 job that you hate. We all have that spirit of the beatniks in some way, shape, or form today. In a weird, twisted sort of way, we all have a little bit of Judy inside us.
Don't you realize you're filling your head with junk? Don't you realize it's just a tool for enforcing juvenile conformity? This, sir, is art. What you see before you isn't just an astronaut, green peas, and a pot roast. What we have here is the death of a boring pageant and the rebirth of history.
The second person I want to focus on next is Roger. On the surface, Roger is your stereotypical over-the-top bully who picks on Doug and makes him do silly stunts that make him look like a fool. But seeing episodes such as Doug Takes a Hike, Doug Saves Roger, and Doug and Patty P.I. paints a different picture on the character. In Doug Takes a Hike, Doug finds a little snake during a hike in the woods to earn a merit badge. Roger is frightened of the snake, although it's completely harmless. Doug was taken advantage by Roger and could have easily told her showcase Roger's ophidiophobia in front of the entire Bluff Scout group. But he didn't. Roger was thankful for that. For a while, anyway. In Doug Saves Roger, Mr. Bones' nephew, Percy Femur, is transferred over to Mrs. Wingo's class, and Roger is being picked on by Percy. At first, Doug was glad that Roger was getting a taste of his own medicine of all the times he picked on him. But eventually, Doug felt bad for Roger and stood up for him when Percy was threatening him. Roger could have ran away from the situation after being free from Percy's clutches. At first, he did. However, he helped Doug by telling Mr. Bone about what his nephew was going to do to Doug after school. In Doug and Patty P.I., Doug and Patty solve a mystery involving with car bumpers stolen needed for a father-son wheelbarrow race at the picnic. After gathering clues and looking at the suspects, Doug figured out that it was Roger who did it. Roger wasn't doing it just because he was a jerk, it was for another reason.
His father doesn't live here anymore, and I guess if Roger couldn't race, he didn't want anyone else to.
Roger's family were divorced, and he and his mom lived in a small trailer home. So the fact that he feels cathartic on picking on others because of his lack of having a father around, as well as living a frugal life compared to BB Bluff, the snobby rich girl, or even his companion Willie, whose father is the mayor of Bluffington, is actually a bit understandable. While not as complex of a bully or anti-hero compared to Helga Pataki from Hey Arnold or Prince Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, Roger nonetheless has had his moments as a trouble bully with a fun personality.
Ooh, funny. Didn't see you coming.
Yeah? What are you looking at? You looking at me? What, you think I look funny? Get out of here! Hello, cuckoo! Hello, cuckoo! Come on, nematodes! Hello, cuckoo! It's your pal Roger! Hello, cuckoo! Hello, cuckoo!
One of the main highlights of Doug is the music. Performed by Dan Sawyer and Fred Newman, the minimalist approach of combining Dan's instrumental performance and Fred's iconic mouth sounds and use of everyday items like rice in a paper bag or tapping sneakers together makes the background music unique and unheard of. According to the Slimed, An Oral History of Nickelodeon's Golden Age book, Dan Sawyer said these statements about the subject of Doug's music. We were like kids ourselves doing the music for Doug. Because it was so sparse and hand-done, it stands out. We didn't feel like we were constrained. Up until that point, most of the music heard in cartoons were derived from Carl Stalling, the guy who set the template for almost all animated cartoons. It's orchestral and has a lot of chromatic runs, and a lot of funny quotes from symphonies. I love that stuff. We were trying to do something different though. I was told years ago that there were 4 or 5 sounds not to use. The first was any human made, like singing, clapping, whistling, anything human-like. We weren't supposed to use that as an underscore. These kind of things would compete too much with the dialogue and take your attention away. We broke a lot of rules on all the Nickelodeon shows in those years. By going on an unsophisticated and unconventional approach to their soundtrack, they created songs that no other show before has done. The way that the music in Doug was featured made the show even more special. Dan and Fred thought big. And then there's one of the best fictional bands of all time, The Beats. The 3 songs that has featured in the show was hands down one of the best moments in Nicktoons history. Even 25 years later, it's still remembered to this day and has become a major staple in our pop culture.
Let's jam!
Going to what I said earlier, Doug was a show that we needed, even though we didn't know that we needed it. Most cartoons around the 80s were split between action-packed cartoons like Transformers, G.I. Joe, and He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, or light-hearted and colorful cartoons such as The Smurfs, My Little Pony, Rainbow Bright, and the Care Bears. What all these cartoons had in common was that they were pre-existing properties trying to sell the latest toy or merchandise. While it is true that Doug did appear as a mascot for a grapefruit juice commercial in 1989, Doug never marketed grapefruit juice in the series. In fact, the mascot's name wasn't even Doug at all. He was originally called Brian. Jim eventually changed it to Doug because he wanted the character's name to be more generic. The basic premise of everyday life of a young kid hadn't been done since at least the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show that ran from 1983 to 1986. For the most part, when Doug came out for Nickelodeon, it was a breath of fresh air to see an original character going through relatable things. Because of Doug, the slice of life genre became a lot more prevalent for children's television. Throughout the later half of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s, cartoons about kids going through everyday situations became a lot more common, and they would put their own spin on the genre, and even improve on the simple formula that Doug laid the foundation for. Because of that, many people look back on Doug and criticize it for being incredibly bland and uninteresting. While I can understand their critiques and can even agree that Doug doesn't hold up as well as the other Nicktoons, because of its simple approach of its premise, art, characters, and music, people still go back to watching Doug, calling it a definitive classic. There's even a new generation of kids who still watch Doug, according to an interview with Jim Jinkins for the Nickelodeon Animation Podcast.
It's beautiful that everything that came out, including Doug, right before and around the internet, it's instantly immortal. It's gonna be around for, you know what I mean? It's gonna be around forever. You know, I can find
Immortal. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
That's, okay. What blew my mind the other day, I got to go speak to a group of fifth graders at a local school about writing and whatever. I love to do that.
Yeah.
And whoever introduced me said, "How many of you have heard of a show called Doug?" Now, I didn't even look up because I'm like, this is going to be crickets, and here we go. And half the kids raised their hand, and I'm like, how?
It's amazing.
But
man.
it's because they can get to it in so many different ways.
Exactly.
And they're tracking it.
Sure, it may not have a complex story or fully fleshed out characters like Avatar or even Steven Universe. Sure, the animation and art style may look primitive compared to today's cartoons. Sure, it doesn't have any action-filled moments like Batman the Animated Series or Young Justice. But what Doug did is nothing more than impactful and identifiable. To conclude this video, I leave you with a quote by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In character, in matter, in style, the supreme excellence is simplicity. That's Doug in a nutshell, and we're better because of it.
Yeah.